The Empress ruled from her palace that floated above the clouds of a violet sky and stretched its crystal towers high enough to catch the light of 3 suns. Her court was vast, her armies strong, and her treasures endless, yet none of these mattered to her as much as the creatures in her nursery, for inside that golden chamber lived her most beloved companions, her baby dragons. They were not yet fierce warriors of flame and shadow, as the legends promised they would become someday. Instead, they were small, round-bodied, and restless, with wings that flapped without rhythm, and claws that clicked against marble floors. They sparkled like living jewels, emerald and sapphire and ruby glimmers that shifted with every twist of their tiny body. Empress would often watch them from her throne-like chair, a smile softening her stern face as the dragons tumbled over one another. Their eyes were bright with curiosity, their tails lashed about, and their breath came out in small bursts of smoke and sparks. Even in their youth they carried the promise of great power, their scales harder than steel, their teeth sharp enough to cut stone, and their cries loud enough to echo across the towers. Yet they were still infants, and their mischief was endless. They chased each other in dizzying circles, knocked over golden bowls of fruit, and curled up to nap on priceless silk cushions. For the palace staff, the nursery was a place of both wonder and terror. Servants whispered of the tiny dragons, setting tapestries aflame with careless snorts and scattering feathers from pillows as if they were snowflakes. Guards told tales of being startled by the shrieking roars that echoed in the middle of the night, startling even the armored sentries stationed outside. For all their beauty, the dragons were wild, untamed, and unpredictable, and no one dared to discipline them for fear of angering the Empress herself. The Empress knew her children needed more than adoration. They needed care, guidance, and someone to watch them closely so that their playful destruction did not grow into true danger. And so she summoned nannies from across the galaxy, beings with reputations for taming the untamable. Each alien who arrived at the palace spoke proudly of their skills. Some had soothed the lava hounds of the volcanic moons, others had calmed the storm serpents of the gas giants, still others had raised broods of poisonous creatures with ease. Each came confident that they would succeed where all others failed. But for now, before the first nanny was even chosen, the nursery remained her domain alone. She sat among the dragons, stroking their scales, though sometimes her gown smoldered from a stray spark. She whispered to them in a voice as soft as velvet, telling them stories of their ancestors, of dragons who had guarded thrones and carried kings through battle. Though they were only babies, they would grow into legends. She loved them for what they were now and for what they would someday become. Every evening, as the 3 suns dipped low and bathed the palace in shades of crimson and gold, the Empress lingered in the nursery, listening to the low rumbling breaths of her children as they settled into slumber. Their tiny wings twitched. In dreams their claws curled around each other, and for a short while the chaos faded, replaced by a peace so tender it softened the hardest of hearts. In those moments the Empress believed her dragons were the greatest treasure in all the galaxy, and she vowed that no matter the challenge, she would see them raised with love and pride. The dragons were adorable to behold, yet their small bodies contained energy that seemed endless. They never stayed still for more than a breath. One would leap onto a pile of cushions, sending silk and feathers flying through the air, while another would dart beneath a table, knocking over trays of crystal cups and scattering jewels across the polished floor. Their wings, though too small to carry them far, beat with such force that the air itself stirred into sudden gusts that blew scrolls and candles across the chamber. The Empress, who adored them, smiled at their every antic, yet the servants who had to clean the chaos trembled at the sound of their footsteps. These little ones were born from ancient fire lines and carried the power of dragons that had once darkened skies in storms of flame. Yet now they were infants, curious, wild, and untrained. Their scales shimmered under the light of the 3 suns, each scale like a fragment of gemstone. Their eyes glowed faintly in shades of molten gold and sapphire blue, their teeth sharp and white. Even in their youth, when they opened their mouths, tiny plumes of fire slipped out, harmless enough most of the time, but enough to scorch curtains or singe the edge of a carpet. The Empress often tried to soothe them with her presence. She would gather them close, her long gown wrapped around their warm bodies, her hands stroking their gleaming scales as she whispered ancient songs from her homeland. Sometimes they quieted, resting their small heads against her lap. Other times they wriggled away with shrill cries that echoed so loudly the guards at the palace gates swore they could hear the roar of beasts groan. Full-size, the palace itself bore scars of their energy. Cracked tiles marked the paths where claws had scratched too hard. Burned edges lined doorways where careless breaths of flame had touched wood. And in the nursery itself, not a single cushion, blanket, or toy remained unbroken. Every object brought in to entertain them was soon destroyed by teeth or claws, or fiery snorts. What one dragon left untouched, another quickly shattered. Still the Empress did not scold, for to her, they were not destructive, they were simply alive. The staff, on the other hand, feared the nursery more than the battlefield. They whispered in the kitchens that the young dragons were cursed. Others claimed they were possessed by restless spirits that demanded freedom. A few brave souls attempted to stand their ground when the dragons rampaged, yet none dared to raise a hand against them, for the Empress loved her children fiercely and would allow no harm to come to them. The dragons seemed to sense this protection, and so they grew even bolder, chasing guards down corridors and knocking trays of food from trembling servants. Night was no calmer than day. Their cries could shake the entire wing of the palace, echoing off crystal walls and keeping ministers and advisors awake until dawn. Servants begged the Empress to hire caretakers skilled in taming wild beasts. The Empress listened, her heart torn, for she knew she could not watch her beloved dragons at all hours and still rule her empire. She knew the time was coming when outsiders would be called upon to step into the golden chamber. In those days, the Empress gazed at her children with both pride and worry. She loved the sparkle of their scales and the sound of their laughter, yet even she could not deny the truth. The dragons were more than a handful. They were a storm waiting to grow, and she needed help before that storm consumed the palace she had sworn to protect. Alien nannies from 100 star systems began to arrive at the palace, each one dressed in garments of their world and carrying tools that had tamed creatures far more fearsome than dragons, or so they claimed. The Empress welcomed them with cautious hope and led them to the nursery, where her beloved children waited. The first nanny came from the ice moons of Vareth, and her skin glowed faintly blue. She carried a staff of frozen crystal and spoke in a voice that could calm avalanches. She bowed low to the Empress, promising that no infant, no matter how fierce, could resist her soothing arts. Yet when she entered the nursery, the dragons sniffed at her staff, their breath melting the frozen crystal into a puddle of water. They snorted smoke in her face and snapped their little teeth at her flowing gown. Within minutes she stumbled backward, her glow dimming, her calm voice turning into shrieks as she fled the chamber, never to return. The second nanny hailed from the swamps of Del, and her body was tall, thin, and covered with moss-like growths. She claimed to have raised amphibian giants, whose tempers were legendary. She stepped into the nursery, her long fingers dripping with green slime that was said to soothe wild beasts. The dragons, however, pounced at her slime-covered hands. Mistaking it for food, they tore the moss from her limbs and scattered it across the golden floor. One dragon sneezed, a burst of fire that left her robe smoking. She screamed and leapt through the nearest window into the palace moat. The third nanny was a mechanical caretaker forged from metal gears and glowing circuits, a marvel of technology from the Forge worlds. She claimed to know no fear and no fatigue. The Empress watched with interest as the metal nanny marched into the nursery, speaking in a steady voice designed to lull infants to sleep. The dragons, however, stared at her gleaming surface and saw not a caretaker, but a toy. They swarmed her, climbing onto her shoulders and tails, wrapping around her arms. Their claws scraped sparks from her body, until one dragon bit into her wiring, releasing a crackle of lightning. The mechanical nanny stiffened, sputtered smoke, and collapsed in a heap of broken gears. The dragons squealed with delight and danced around her, remains one after another. More nannies tried and failed. Some carried lullaby flutes that shattered under the weight of dragon roars. Others brought nets of starlight that the dragons tore apart as easily as claw. And Nanny from the desert worlds brought sands that were meant to calm restless spirits. But the dragons simply sneezed the grains into storms that blinded her, until she ran out weeping. Every attempt ended the same way, with chaos, fire, and laughter from the dragons, while the nannies fled in fear or despaired. The Empress tried to remain patient, yet with each failure her heart grew heavier. She saw the disappointment in the faces of her advisors, who whispered that perhaps the dragons could never be tamed. Perhaps they were creatures meant to rule free skies, not nurseries. Perhaps no hand but hers could guide them, and even she was not enough. The nursery that had once filled her heart with joy now filled her nights with worry, for if the greatest nannies in the galaxy could not stay even an hour, how could her children ever find peace? Yet the dragons cared little for the parade of failed caretakers. To them each nanny was another game, another challenge, another opportunity for mischief. They played, they laughed, they set sparks flying, and when the chamber grew quiet again, they curled around each other and slept as if nothing had happened, their innocence remained untouchable, and in their eyes the galaxy was still a playground, no matter how many aliens fled from their side. The Empress grew weary, as one by one the caretakers abandoned their posts, leaving the nursery in disarray. Her halls, that once echoed with songs of triumph, now carried the cries of frightened servants and the crackle of small dragonfires. She sat upon her throne of crystal, her crown heavy upon her brow, and wondered how a ruler of galaxies could be brought so low by creatures who barely reached her knee. Every morning she rose to petitions from governors and generals, yet her mind was always with the nursery, where the chaos never ceased. The advisors spoke in hushed voices, suggesting that the dragons be kept in chains or confined to a chamber of stone. Some even dared to whisper that the dragons should be sent away to distant worlds, where they might grow without endangering the empire. The Empress silenced them all with a glare sharper than any blade, for these were not beasts to her. These were her children, the legacy of her bloodline, and the future of her reign. To harm them was unthinkable. To abandon them was betrayal, yet even she could not deny the truth that their power was growing. Each day the nursery bore the scars of failure, its walls blackened with soot, its floor cracked by claws, its windows smeared with smoke and ash. The staff entered only when ordered, their hands shaking as they carried trays of food made of charred meat and molten minerals. The dragons would leap at the trays, spilling half before it reached the ground. The Empress would enter after, and see the wreckage, her heart torn between laughter and sorrow. The nannies had not lasted long enough to bring order, not long enough to teach even a single lesson. All that remained were fragments of toys, melted fabrics, and the lingering stench of smoke. She walked through the palace gardens at night, seeking peace among the silver trees and glowing flowers, but even there she heard echoes of dragon roars carried by the wind. The stars above offered no comfort, for she had hoped that the wisdom of other worlds would bring her relief. Instead, she found herself more isolated than ever, a mother alone with children who defied all control. She loved them deeply, yet love alone could not soothe them. She had to admit this truth to herself, and it cut deeper than any enemy blade. Rumors spread across the empire that the Empress was losing her grip. Ministers wondered if the dragons were a curse sent by jealous gods. Rivals in distant systems whispered of weakness, hoping to seize the throne for all her victories on the battlefield. None mattered if her home was undone from within. Her heart ached as she imagined her children used as symbols of her failure, when in truth they were symbols of life itself, of flame and freedom and unyielding spirit. Still, she refused to yield. She stood before the nursery each dawn, lifting her chin as the doors opened and smoke rolled out. She entered with steady steps, her gown trailing across the scorched floor, her voice calm though her heart pounded. She gathered her dragons in her arms when they allowed it, and sang to them until her voice grew hoarse. She reminded herself that chaos was the nature of fire, and fire, when guided, could become warmth and light. She would not let despair claim her, even as every attempt at order crumbled. Yet deep within, she felt the weight of loneliness. The galaxy brimmed with wonders and wisdoms, yet none could help her now. The dragons were hers, and hers alone, and though her spirit was strong, she wondered how long she could endure this trial. Then word spread of a strange idea, whispered first among the lowest servants, and carried upward through the palace, until it reached the ears of the Empress herself. The whispers spoke of a human child, not a trained nanny, not a wise elder, but a simple infant from a distant world, a child who was said to carry laughter like a gift, and innocence like a shield. Some claimed the human race possessed no natural defenses, no claws, no fire, no wings, only the power of spirit and emotion. Perhaps it was foolishness, yet the story grew each time it was told, until even the Empress, who had dismissed countless tales of miracle solutions, found herself wondering if there was truth hidden within the tale. Came from a merchant who had once traveled to a blue and green planet far from the heart of the empire. He spoke of how human children laughed easily, how their joy was contagious even to animals feared across the stars. He told of great hounds with fangs like spears who lay docile beside laughing infants. He told of wild beasts who turned gentle when tiny hands reached for them. Some mocked his words, calling them superstition, born of primitive worlds. Others leaned closer and listened, for the Empress had tried everything else, and all had failed. The Empress at first resisted the idea, for how could a mere baby succeed where nannies of power and wisdom had failed? She thought of her dragons, fierce and wild, and saw only danger. Yet each day the nursery grew louder, more chaotic, and her heart heavier. Still the whispers came, servants repeating the same claim that only a human child could soothe the storm. Her advisors debated, furiously, some declaring it an insult to the throne to consider such a plan, others urging her to try, for no harm could come from one last attempt. At last, the Empress stood alone upon her balcony, gazing at the three suns as they sank behind the horizon. Her dragons roared in the distance, their cries echoing across the towers. She closed her eyes and admitted to herself what she had denied for weeks. She was desperate, she was tired, she needed help, even if that help came from the most unlikely of sources. She summoned the merchant and demanded proof, and he promised to bring a human infant to the palace if she dared allow it. Word of her decision spread like fire across the empire. Some called it madness to place a fragile creature among dragons. Others whispered that destiny had guided this choice, that perhaps the bond of fire and laughter was written in the stars. Long caravans arrived at the gates of the palace, each bringing gifts for the dragons in hopes of currying favor. Yet the Empress waited only for one. A small vessel landed in the gardens, and from it stepped caretakers carrying a cradle. Within lay the human child. The infant was no larger than the arm of the Empress, her skin soft, her hair fine, and her eyes wide. With wonder she cooed as the wind carried the scent of dragons toward her. She laughed as if the palace itself amused her. The Empress watched with both awe and dread, for this child was ordinary and fragile, and yet the hope of her empire now rested in her tiny hands. The Empress hesitated but agreed, and the human infant was placed among the dragons on a blanket in the grand nursery. The chamber was heavy with smoke, and the air shimmered with heat as the baby dragons stirred at the scent of something unfamiliar. Their scales caught the light of the golden lanterns, their wings flapping in restless rhythm, and their eyes gleamed with suspicion. The servants who had carried the cradle quickly retreated, their steps hurried as fear clutched at their hearts. None wished to remain in the room when dragons grew curious, for curiosity often led to flames. The Empress stood tall, her hands gripping the rail that circled the chamber. Her heart pounded beneath her jeweled robes, though her face remained calm. She had faced warlords with armies at their command. She had crossed battlefields drenched in blood and returned victorious. Yet never had she felt such uncertainty as she did watching her children stalk toward the tiny human girl. The infant cooed and reached for the dangling tassel of the blanket as if the world itself was a toy. She knew nothing of fear, nothing of fire, nothing of the danger. Before her, the largest of the young dragons crept forward, its tail dragging sparks along the floor. Its nostrils flared, smoke curling into the air as it sniffed at the strange creature. The other dragons circled, their claws scraping against marble, their wings beating short gusts that sent feathers and ash swirling. The Empress clenched her jaw. Every instinct demanded she rush forward, seize the child, and call an end to this madness. Yet she forced herself still. For this was the test, and if the whispers held truth, then the child must meet the dragons without shield or weapon. The baby turned her head, her wide eyes fixing on the dragon, who loomed above her. She laughed, a sound pure and bright that cut through the heavy air. The dragons paused their movements, stilled as though frozen by a spell. The infant clapped her hands together and squealed with delight, as if the towering beast was nothing more than a playmate. She kicked her feet and reached upward, fingers grasping at the glittering scales that shimmered inches from her face. The dragon blinked its molten eyes, narrowing in confusion. It opened its mouth, a glow rising in its throat, and the Empress felt her heart lurch. But instead of flame, a puff of smoke drifted out, soft and harmless. The baby sneezed at the smoke, then burst into giggles, her laughter ringing like bells. The dragon tilted its head, uncertain, almost shy, and stepped closer, lowering its massive snout until it brushed against the infant. The baby patted the warm scales and babbled nonsense words, her smile never fading. The other dragons watched. In silence, their tails twitched, their wings rustled, but none attacked. Slowly, one by one, they drew closer, until the human child was surrounded, yet she remained cheerful. She reached for each of them, touching scales, claws, wings with tiny hands, unafraid. The nursery that had been filled with fire and fear was now filled with the sound of laughter so strange and unexpected that even the Empress herself let out a breath she had not known she was holding. At first the dragons snarled and flapped their wings, but the baby girl only laughed and quapped her tiny hands. The sound rang through the nursery like the chiming of silver bells, cutting through smoke and fear. The Empress watched in disbelief as the fiercest of her brood lowered its head inches from the fragile child, and instead of roaring, it sniffed at her hair and released only a soft huff of warm air. The baby squealed with joy and reached forward, tugging at the tip of its scaled nose. The dragon blinked once, then twice, clearly baffled, for no creature had ever dared to treat it with such simple affection. The other dragons shifted uneasily, circling the scene, their wings beat at the air, their tails lashed against the floor, sparks scattering from the marble, yet none struck. The baby clapped again, her voice rising in gurgling laughter as she patted the nearest dragon as though it were a toy stuffed with feathers. Her joy was without hesitation, and her trust was without question. The dragons paused as though caught in a spell, their sharp eyes softening in curiosity. One dragon released a sudden snort of smoke that curled in the air above the child. The infant sneezed, her tiny nose wrinkling before she burst once more into laughter. That laugh was unlike anything the dragons had ever heard. It was not the frightened scream of a servant, nor the stern command of a soldier, nor even the soothing lullaby of the Empress. It was pure, unguarded delight, a sound that carried no fear, no malice, only wonder. The dragons tilted their heads, their ears twitching, their bodies still as though listening to music too strange to ignore. The smallest dragon edged forward, its claws clicking on the stone floor. It nudged the baby with its snout, gently testing, and the girl giggled again, tugging at the smooth scale that gleamed beneath her hand. The dragon released a sound unlike its usual growl. A low rumble vibrated from deep in its chest, at first sharp, then rolling, softer until it became something new. The Empress leaned forward, her eyes wide, her breath caught in her throat, for she realized the impossible. The dragon was chuckling. The sound grew bolder as the infant continued her playful gestures. One dragon after another joined in a chorus of strange rumbling noises like thunder softened into warmth. The nursery that had once been a place of chaos and fear now trembled with a new energy, not of fire but of laughter. The baby rocked on her blanket, clapping with glee, while the dragons surrounded her, their sharp teeth flashing, not in menace but in joy. Servants, peeking through the cracked doors, gasped and covered their mouths in disbelief, for they had never seen the dragons so calm, so content. The Empress herself felt tears sting her eyes. She who had faced armies without flinching, now stood trembling before the sight of her children transformed by nothing more than a fragile child, and the sound of her laughter. The moment stretched long and bright, a promise that change was not only possible but already unfolding. The dragons stopped their tantrums and tilted their heads in wonder. Then, one by one, they began to chuckle with her. The sound was strange, at first like stones rolling down a mountain, but it grew lighter and warmer until it filled the nursery with rhythm. The baby girl clapped her hands and bounced on the blanket, each burst of her laughter drawing another deeper rumble from the dragons. They rolled onto their backs, wings flapping in awkward delight, their claws curling harmlessly as they mimicked the sound of the infant who had no fear. The nursery that once shook with fire now echoed with something far rarer, the sound of joy. The Empress could hardly believe her eyes. Her children, who had sent warriors and nannies fleeing in terror, were now calm and playful. Their eyes glowed with wonder, not fury. Their tails flicked with excitement, not rage. She took a slow step closer, her gown brushing the scorched floor, her breath held tight in her chest. The baby glanced up at her and offered a smile as though inviting her to share in the miracle. The Empress lowered herself to her knees, her hands trembling as she reached toward the dragons, who did not hiss or roar but leaned closer as if to share the warmth of the moment. Servants gathered at the doorway, their eyes wide in disbelief. For weeks they had feared to enter the chamber. Now they pressed closer, desperate to witness the impossible. Ministers, too, arrived, whispering among themselves, their voices filled with shock. The sound of laughter spilled out into the corridors, spreading faster than any rumor. Soon guards in shining armor and cooks with flowers still on their hands stood side by side, listening to the nursery that had once been a place of dread. The palace itself seemed transformed, the walls reflecting not firelight but the brightness of something gentler. One dragon nudged the baby with its snout, and she reached up, patting its scaled face as if it were a beloved toy. Another dragon curled around her, forming a living cradle of glimmering wings. The baby yawned, her tiny mouth opening wide before she nestled against the warm scales. The dragons shifted protectively, surrounding her with their bodies as if she had always belonged to them. Their eyes closed, their rumbles softened into a soothing chorus that matched the rhythm of her breath. The Empress placed her hand upon the nearest dragon and felt its warmth steady and calm. The court that had doubted the Empress now stood silent, their arguments forgotten. None dared to speak against what they had seen, for no words could deny the truth. The dragons had chosen the human child. They had accepted her laughter as their own. They had laid down their chaos for her innocence. The Empress rose, her heart light. For the first time in many cycles, she looked upon her people and knew that this moment would echo through the stars. The dragons had found their peace, and with it so had she. The nursery glowed not from fire but from harmony. harmony, and every witness understood that they had been present at the birth of a new story, one that would be told across the empire for generations to come. From that day the Empress no longer needed alien nannies, for the baby girl had brought peace and laughter to the dragons. The palace that once shook with roars and fire now hummed with a different music, the gentle sound of play and joy every morning. The Empress entered the nursery to find her children curled protectively around the human child, their wings draped like blankets, their claws tucked carefully away. The dragons who once snapped and hissed at strangers now blinked with calm eyes. Whenever she stirred, they had chosen her as one of their own. The Empress watched this bond with awe, for she knew that no decree of hers had commanded it, and no training could have forced it. The dragons had listened to something deeper than discipline. They had answered the pure laughter of a child, a sound free from fear and ambition. She realized then that power was not always found in flame or steel or crown. Sometimes it was found in innocence, in the unshaken spirit of one who did not know what it meant to fear. The news spread swiftly through the empire. Stories traveled faster than ships, and soon every world whispered of the human infant who had tamed the untamable. Some doubted and called it fantasy, yet others believed with fervor. They sent gifts of silk and crystal, hoping to honor the child who had soothed the brood of fire. The Empress accepted these offerings with grace, but she knew the truth could not be bought. The miracle belonged not to wealth or wisdom, but to the strange and simple strength of laughter. Advisors who once urged her to chain the dragons now bowed their heads in silence. They saw with their own eyes that the nursery was transformed. They heard with their own ears that the roars had softened into chuckles, and that the thunder of chaos had quieted into harmony. The Empress allowed herself to smile before them. For the first time in many seasons, her heart was lighter, her crown no longer a burden, for her children had found peace, and so had she. The baby grew swiftly under the guardianship of the dragons. She crawled between their tails, tugging at scales without harm. She learned to walk upon marble floors guided by their wings. She spoke her first words while perched upon the back of the smallest dragon, her laughter filling the chamber like sunlight. Even the palace itself seemed brighter. The soot washed away the broken stones, repaired as though the very walls had been waiting for this new beginning. The Empress knew that future remained uncertain, for the dragons would grow, and with them their fire would grow as well. Yet she no longer feared the days to come, for she had seen the path that laughter carved. She had seen how innocence could disarm fury, and how joy could bind even the fiercest of spirits together. The dragons and the child would shape a future that no prophecy could have foretold. Thus, the legend of the Empress and her baby dragons became forever tied to the story of a fragile human girl who made them laugh. And in that laughter the empire found hope, the palace found peace, and the Empress found the strength to rule not through fear but through love.